Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with Stephen Knott about his just-released book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. Stephen Knott is an excellent scholar of the American presidency. He's written, by my count, half a dozen books on various presidents, including Washington and Hamilton, the alliance that forged America, which we reviewed at Law and Liberty, as well as Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth, Secret and Sanctioned, Covert Operations, and the American Presidency, as well as a number of other titles. Stephen Knott, we're glad to welcome you back to Liberty Law Talk.
Oh, thank you, Richard. I'm delighted to be here.
So thinking about your book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, I want to read one of your statements on the opening page of the book in the introduction entitled, The Long Declining Road. And so I'll follow that up with a question to you. You say, this book is a lament for what has happened to the American presidency, and more importantly, the American political order writ large. Things in that order, we might say, are out of sort. And this is not simply due to the election of Donald Trump. The American presidency has lost the respect it once held, and the roots of that loss predate Trump. What's happened to the American presidency?
Well, I think the presidency, unfortunately, for quite some time now, we've moved away from the founders' conception of the presidency. And look, I know by saying the founders, that's painting a pretty broad brush, and not all of the founders would have agreed with this position. But the position of people like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, was that the president should act as a head of state. The president should act as a in a restrained and moderate manner. And certainly in the case of Washington and Hamilton, they believed that the presidency should serve as a check on popular passion. And we've turned that entirely on its head, and we now expect, at least for 100 years or so, presidents to sort of fuel those passions, fire up the base, both serve public opinion and also try to shape it. And so this book, as you mentioned, is a lament for that lost soul of the American presidency, which I see personified particularly in the presidency of George Washington, but also some of his 19th century successors. I should say also, I just said the last 100 years or so, I do make the case in the book that sort of the door to the more populist public opinion shaping presidency was kind of kicked open first by Thomas Jefferson and later by Andrew Jackson. So the progressive presidents of the 20th century certainly have some role models to follow in the presidencies of Jefferson and Jackson.
Let's think more concretely about when we say the founders' presidency or the constitutional presidency. So you've outlined that a bit here in your answer. But maybe what evidence do you point to, or maybe practice? You mentioned George Washington, other thinkers in the 19th century. You even have some honorable mentions in the 20th century. But what are you pointing to help us think more concretely and specifically about a constitutional presidency?
I spent quite a bit of time, certainly in the first chapter, outlining both Washington and Hamilton's view, as I just mentioned, that the president, one of his key responsibilities is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that may require the president to stand up to some passing wave, some passing passion that's sweeping through the public. And this notion of the tyranny of the majority was widely shared by not just Federalists like Hamilton, and I would argue that Washington was a Federalist as well, but it was certainly also shared by James Madison. The outlier here is Thomas Jefferson, who was far more confident in the wisdom of public opinion, of the wisdom of the public at large, And for much of the 19th century, I think Washington's example held, again, with the glaring exceptions of Jefferson and Jackson. But that all comes to a crashing halt with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But again, that earlier conception, that constitutional conception of the presidency that we can see in both Washington and Hamilton, it's a presidency rooted in the idea that public opinion has to be respected, certainly through the voting process and other democratic procedures. But it's more important, it's equally, I would say, excuse me, not equally, but more important for the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I think we've just lost that understanding.
You talk also in that opening chapter, and I wonder if you maybe could expound more on it here. We have this idea, it's, pin it to Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, of the president being the only figure in the federal government who represents the nation as a whole. And, from that is derived, or they advocated this notion, well, the president should be big and should be significant in what he does because he is the lone national representative, not beholden to parochial or local interest. And I wondered if maybe you could talk about this idea of the president, or maybe under the founder's presidency, of there's a similar representation of the nation as a whole, but it's a representation through the Constitution and representing the Constitution itself against majority passions or things sort of bubbling up. And that's the point of the veto. The point of the veto is maybe what Populist talks about, that famous phrase, the auxiliary precautions,
Yes, that's absolutely true, Richard. So the president, I believe, was given formidable powers, including the veto, to allow him and to encourage him, I think, to withstand popular passions, popular fads, the latest whims of the public. And so, in my view, the American president was given a far ample weapons, if you will, to conduct himself, as Hamilton would put it, in an energetic fashion. This is just not enough for the progressives of the early 20th century. And it apparently wasn't enough for Jefferson and Jackson in a sense. And so by shifting the presidency away from its constitutional mooring and rooting it more in public opinion and in his public standing, we've lost something very important, which is that the president ultimately serves as a check on those unruly public passions. And I think that's just been an incredible loss to the body politic writ large.
Also, as well, I mean, you also talk about Hamilton being someone who defined the American founding. Certainly, we know his contributions in the Federalist Papers on that score. But a lot of people think Hamilton is sort of, if there is a progressive hook in the founding, it's Hamilton. That's one view. Talk more about that, why you think Hamilton's wisdom here is needed.
Yeah, in my view, Hamilton, the libertarian take on Hamilton is off the mark. He is frequently portrayed as a champion of big government, of the modern social welfare state. And I just don't think that's accurate at all. And by the way, I would sort of steer your listeners towards the work of Carson Holloway, professor, I believe, at the University of Omaha.
A frequent contributor to Law and Liberty.
Yeah, there you go. He's done a tremendous amount of work, good work, refuting this idea that Hamilton is sort of, LBJ in a waistcoat and breeches. He was not. Hamilton did believe in an energetic government, but in Hamilton's view, the federal government should limit itself to preparations for war, conducting war, facilitating commerce between the states, and of course facilitating international commerce or international trade. So it was a fairly, I believe, constricted definition of what kinds of tasks the federal government should undertake. I simply do not believe that a man who could write the following phrase, "Power over a man's subsistence is the power over a man's will," would have been comfortable with many elements of the modern welfare state. So to equate Alexander Hamilton with Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson, in my view, is just off the mark.
Many would argue, and that the crucial moment turning in the American presidency and power was Woodrow Wilson. You certainly talk a lot about Wilson in your book, but yet you also, and you've mentioned this, Jefferson and Jackson's presidencies are crucial in forming this idea of a populist presidency. What do you pull from their examples as being a part of this? So you mentioned Jefferson wanting to root the presidency in popular opinion. You also talk about the Revolution of 1800. What's Jefferson do and what does Jackson do?
Well, I think Jefferson refound the American presidency after his, as he called it, Revolution of 1800. He is determined, I think, to shift the office in the direction of being both a shaper and a responder to public opinion. And you see that in some things like his support for the 12th Amendment. I think he even toyed for a time with the idea of abolishing the Electoral College. And of course, he's just got this unbridled faith in the wisdom of the public and believes that, for instance, constitutions should be revised every generation. Believes that, the majority, as Andrew Jackson would later put it, the majority is to govern. And I don't, he doesn't have what I would consider to be a healthy sense of the potential abuses of majority rule. And so, sure enough, you see during this period of Jefferson and Jackson, not necessarily with Jefferson leading the way, but there is an attempt to disenfranchise free blacks that takes place throughout the North and South during the Jefferson and Jackson years by the party of Jefferson and Jackson. And I spend quite a bit of time in this book talking about race and racism, which is obviously very much in the news today, and it's discussed widely throughout the United States. And the fact is that this party that championed majority rule and the will of the majority was has a pretty bad track record when it comes to disenfranchising unpopular minorities. And in this case, free blacks, primarily in the North, although not exclusively, and also the Native American population. So you can see that the impact of this, if the majority is to govern, minorities are going to pay a price. And I think throughout American history, this notion of the majority is to govern has cost not only racial minorities, but I would even argue economic minorities some of their rights. So there's just this thrust during the era of Jefferson and Jackson of moving the nation away from, I would argue, its constitutional mooring, moving the presidency away from its constitutional mooring, and fully reflecting, fully implementing the will of the public. And that comes at a very high price to those who are out of step with the majority.
So interesting here, maybe this is a wrinkle, because when we think of progressive presidencies, we think of expansive federal power. And as you note in the book also, and we've had people frequently in Law Liberty talk about this idea of the politics of war, that every issue is a right and wrong, absolute issue. There's no dissent. The dissenters are evil. We have to have, so we have to have a war on poverty, a war on drugs, et cetera, et cetera. All this continues. But Jefferson and Jackson are advocates of limited government, very much so, small government, decentralized government. So if we say they're the beginning of the populist presidency, is it in this vein that is a majoritarianism that unites the president to his office, or makes his office substantial, and sort of you lose this idea of auxiliary precautions that we were talking about earlier?
That is correct. That is the argument I make. I completely acknowledge the idea that Jefferson and Jackson would not be comfortable with the aggressive, progressive agenda of the 20th century, which sought to nationalize problems that would normally be handled at the state and local level. So there's no question. There's not a consistent policy approach, if you will. Jefferson and Jackson are not seeking to create the modern administrative state, no question. But I think, unfortunately, what they did do is set the stage for this notion that the president, as Woodrow Wilson would put it, should be as big a man as he wishes to be. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of personalization of the presidency. There's a rooting of the presidency, as I've said, in popular consent. There's this notion that you referred to earlier that the president is uniquely situated to speak for the nation as a whole. And that's a Jefferson and Jacksonian concept that TR and Wilson will build on. And of course, there's a reason why many 20th century progressive historians, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. comes immediately to mind, that will try to link the actions, for instance, of Franklin Roosevelt with Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
It is a stretch in terms of their policy proposals, their policy prescriptions, but I don't think it is a stretch when it comes to their conception of the role that the president should play as an implementer of the wishes of the majority.
So when you think about Jackson's presidency, what stands out to you as sort of embodying this populist understanding in his administration?
Well, I believe it's in his first annual message to Congress that he makes the statement that the majority is to govern. And he will go on through the next 8 years, in many cases not necessarily succeeding in this vein, but for instance, suggesting at one point that the Electoral College be abolished. And I would even throw into the mix, and perhaps this is a little bit unfair, but both of those campaigns that he runs, but particularly, well, both in 1824 and in 1828, these are very much modern campaigns. There's a celebration of the man himself, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. There's almost a kind of cult-like following that develops around Jackson in both 1824 and 1828. And of course, he has the perfect foil in John Quincy Adams, who is one of these, sort of stuffy East Coast elitist, not a backslapper, not a people person, kind of cold and distant. And Jackson is the raw frontiersman who you'd like to have at your, barbecue or have a beer with. And Adams, in a sense, certainly in 1828, just doesn't stand a chance against this populist image making of this rough frontiersman, this military hero, who's the kind of guy you'd want to go out with and have a beer. And it's that kind of popularizing of the presidency that I think is one of the more significant elements of Jackson's tenure. And then I would add to that, this is a period of time, as I mentioned before, where at least at the state level, there are efforts to widely disenfranchise free blacks who tend not to be supporters of the Democratic Party. And also, of course, I think Jackson's somewhat draconian treatment of the Native American population. Again, to me, these are perfect examples of the presidency in service to the tyranny of the majority.
A question that comes to my mind as I read your book, and I'm guessing you gave some thought to it because it's sort of on the surface. Is this not just the gradual, and maybe we can just do a Tocqueville analysis, isn't this just what democracies do to power? To flatten it out, to make it majoritarian, to make it subject to passions, to lead politicians to act in certain ways. Even thinking as you're describing Jackson's campaign, of course, were also the 1840 campaign of log cabin and hard cider, Tippecanoe, and that campaign, which was a Whig campaign. Um, is that just sort of inevitable? And even with the progressives, you get this other part of Tocqueville that a democratic people looks up to the state, and maybe we can say the president embodies that state.
Yeah, sadly, Richard, I think I would probably agree with you that there was something inevitable about this, that it is sort of part and parcel for a democratic regime to devolve in this direction. I would argue, I do argue, that it was this descent, in my view, it is a descent, was hastened by the actions of a series of American presidents who believed they had a vision that was superior to that of the founders or the framers. And again, that would be Jefferson, Jackson, T.R. Wilson, and some of their 20th century successors. And I think in Jefferson's case in particular, I argue that while it certainly was, there certainly probably was public demand, for instance, to either modify or get rid of the Alien and Sedition Act, I'm not sure there was a great public demand to sort of refound the presidency in its entirety. And I lay that in Jefferson's lap and also, of course, in Jackson's lap. So, again, I do agree that there is a kind of element of inevitability perhaps about this, but it was hastened by these presidents who possessed these visions of remaking the presidency, remaking American society, and they hastened this decline, unfortunately.
What's the significance of Woodrow Wilson's, I was thinking both as a scholar and a president, to shaping the institution?
I see Wilson, I've already received some criticism for perhaps not giving enough attention to TR. I do pay some attention to TR, but I give far more credit or blame to Woodrow Wilson for transforming the presidency. Because I think, first of all, the Wilsonian conception of the presidency takes root within the Democratic Party before it takes root in the Republican Party. In other words, TR's example as a Republican, it takes much longer for the Republican Party, I think, to embrace elements of the TR presidency. And so Wilson, to me, seems more significant in that regard. Plus, he's a scholar. He's respected by a number of academics and opinion shapers in the United States. So I just see him as a more substantial figure when it comes to this question of refounding, again, further refounding the American presidency. And I think he does that in a number of ways. He's an advocate, for instance, for a direct primary system that both parties would hold direct national primaries, removing the filtering effect that party leaders provided. In a sense, party leaders, following Martin Van Buren's example, served as a kind of substitute for the original electoral college, sort of weeding out candidates of low character. Wilson wants to remove that altogether. Again, there's this unbridled confidence in the wisdom of the public. His support for the direct election of U.S. senators. His belief, as I said earlier, that the president should be as big a man as he wants to be. Just a kind of boundless conception of presidential power. And on top of all of that, Wilson's contempt for the framers, his contempt for the idea that one should remain obedient to a constitution that, as he would put it, was written in horse and buggy days. We have evolved. Our systems, our processes, electoral processes must evolve with the times. He does a good job on occasion, sort of hiding his contempt for the Constitution and the framers, but it certainly emerges at times. And so in that sense, I see him as a very important figure in this saga.
Yeah, and there's also obviously this sort of the beginning, well, not the, I don't know if it's the beginning, but certainly this idea of federal government power leading to grand objectives, having to be employed for grand objectives. Of course, obviously World War I stands out under Wilson's tenure. In the way, I mean, this is sort of, would you say, the mobilization for World War I changes the country?
Good. Yeah, absolutely, Rich. Yeah, this notion of the president must have some type of a vision, must lead the public into the promised land, must build on the bully pulpit that Teddy Roosevelt directs, that the president is, in a sense, the nation's educator. All of that, putting the presidency front and center in our constitutional system. And again, coupled with this underlying contempt for the original architects of the American Constitution.
You have some discussion in the book of direct election of United States senators and the changeover from state legislatures picking them, the constitutional amendment to make that possible. What's the significance of that regarding presidential power?
Probably. Look, I mean, it is again enshrining this notion that filtering public opinion, any sort of intermediate bodies that might refine and enlarge public opinion, are somehow inappropriate for a democratic people. Now, look, I'm well aware of the fact that under the old system, a lot of senators who were elected were hardly, these great lawgivers. Many of them were corrupt individuals. Many of them appear to have been owned by certain railroads and certain other corporate interests. But I think the shift towards direct election of senators, again, it's just part of this bigger movement towards popularizing both the presidency and the United States Senate, removing those filtration elements, if you will. I don't spend too much time talking about the Senate, but again, it's part and parcel of this larger effort to democratize American politics.
No, I mean, that's interesting. That's interesting, too. You talk about representation and, representation happening through Congress, through the Senate, through state and local bodies, through even the original idea of the Electoral College. But contrast all of that with how does representation happen with a massive executive branch being sort of the national representative? It's certainly a different kind of representation of trying to, it's certainly one that doesn't have the compromise of, say, the committee system in Congress, among other things.
Right. Well, yes, look, this is where I'm very much in agreement with a lot of critics of the modern administrative state, again, which is arguably a Wilsonian, certainly Wilson and FDR creation, but Wilson's belief in a kind of bureaucratic expertise. This is a troubling development in my view.
It tends to make. It tends to make too. Chris DeMuth has written on this idea of executive deciding so many of these crucial issues tends to make everything a national referendum. Tends to constantly keep us agitated and excited when things come down through executive order, or decisions in the administrative state versus congressional debate, compromise, etc.
Excellent point. And again, I do think if we were to sort of restore the constitutional presidency or the lost soul of the American presidency, it would contribute at least in part to diffusing these sort of just constant battles over every issue that comes down the pike. And by nationalizing all these issues, we're just in a constant state of agitation. I could not agree more. And again, I think if we were to return to this older understanding of the presidency, that would help somewhat to sort of diffuse this perpetual agitation that we seem to be locked in.
Thinking here, you've written a lot about national security. You wrote a book on George W. Bush and the way he prosecuted the war on terror. How is has your research and thinking for this book Has it sort of challenged conceptions you have about foreign policy and military power as it's been exercised by the United States during the 20th century?
Well, I certainly had to think long and hard again about my consistent championing of presidential discretion when it comes to foreign policy and national security. And I do touch on this occasionally throughout the book. I would still argue that under this constitutional conception of the office, under this lost conception of the office, the American president still possessed significant powers when it comes to national security and foreign policy. I'm not arguing, as perhaps some libertarian critics of the presidency would argue, that the president needs to be reined in this area. I believe that this constitutional presidency possesses enough powers to do what is necessary for the security interests of the United States, consonant with the Constitution. And I point to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as examples of presidents who I believe were respectful of the constitutional presidency, but conducted themselves as commanders-in-chief in a way that protected the security interests of the United States. So I did have to deal with this. I did have to wrestle with this. But I'm convinced that the Constitution grants the president the appropriate amount of power necessary to protect this nation. And a return to this older understanding of the presidency, I don't think would threaten our security interests whatsoever, and arguably might enhance them in that there would be perhaps more popular and congressional support for assertive presidential actions in the realm of foreign affairs and national security.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of, and this is something that people frequently say is you can't understand the growth of executive power in the administrative state without Congress's actually building it. And likewise, with foreign power, Congress has also abdicated itself as chosen in many respects.
Yep.
I mean, exceptions you talk about. You talk about exceptions with the Vietnam War, the decision of Congress to cut off funding, being sort of and also after Nixon's presidency, sort of an attempt with the War Powers Act. So there's this attempt to reclaim power, although we might say that's an unconstitutional attempt of Congress to reclaim powers that the Constitution delegated to the executive branch. I guess a lot of our listeners will be familiar with critiques of Wilson or FDR. You have really blistering chapter, I thought, in the book on JFK. You want to talk about that some?
Yeah, sure.
Which, I mean, I welcome the chapter. I welcome puncturing the Camelot myth each and every opportunity we can get. But I thought yours was particularly sharp. So maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm probably putting my life at risk since I live in Massachusetts, and he's still very much a revered figure.
Well,
including amongst some.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ross Douthat, the New York Times conservative columnist, one time criticized the Camelot myth. He said, and I think he said it was the most vitriolic mail he'd ever received after that column. So,
I believe it. Yeah. Well, God bless them. If my parents were still alive and they were to read that chapter, I'd probably be getting mail from them. Yeah, and look, I used to work at the John F. Kennedy Library. I grew up in a New Deal, New Frontier family, and I do have a few good things to say about President Kennedy in that chapter. I thought he showed a certain amount of political courage in embracing, somewhat belatedly, but embracing civil rights at a fairly significant political cost to him. It would have been interesting to see how many southern states he would have carried in 1964, but Kennedy's use of television, Kennedy's use of which was very effective, his use of Look magazine, Life magazine, of crafting this image of a young, vigorous president with a beautiful wife and charming children, building that bond that personal bond that Woodrow Wilson frequently spoke of. He did remarkably. He's only president for 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days, and he does sort of set a standard that every president since then, and arguably Trump excluded, every president since then has tried to match. And I think it's been somewhat destructive because the qualities that are celebrated in President Kennedy, I think, frequently are very superficial ones. I often wonder if an Abraham Lincoln or John Quincy Adams could ever get elected today. In fact, I don't think they could. And part of that is this John F. Kennedy, Martin Sheen, West Wing view of the president as attractive and great hair, which I'm probably a little jealous of. You know, all of those superficial qualities, I think, have, in a certain way, demeaned the office. And perhaps it's unfair to me to put all that on John F. Kennedy, but I think he does represent a significant break with the past.
The TV media age president. He really, exactly. And the rhetoric. I mean, that was also something part of the chapter, just stringing together his speeches and this rather soaring rhetoric, which even, growing up, in the 80s and 90s, as I was reading your chapter, I sort of brought back some memories of things I was given as in elementary school, and sort of Kennedy's gifts to America and these sorts of speeches calling us to heroic deeds, or calling the country to heroic deeds during the Cold War. But yet and this is something you talk about in the book, this rhetoric of the populist presidency leads to unfulfilled expectations and leads to decreasing confidence in government. Something that many have noted is Americans, well, I mean, and there's a lot of institutions throughout the country Americans don't trust anymore, and that's a whole other discussion, but Americans' trust in the federal government is pretty low right now. But, in the 60s, when this period we're talking about, very high. Opinion polls, same question, same polling firm, and the decline is dramatic. And I think you make the true point that it's related to the growth in government, the things it says it's going to do and what it can actually accomplish, not to mention its dysfunctionality, and people lose faith and hope in it. Yet, as I'm reading your book and thinking about, I have not subjected myself to the current presidential debates in the Democratic Party, but yet clearly there's a hunger for even more of this. We never really seem to learn. Maybe I've been ranting on there, so.
No, I agree. I explicitly say in the book that even after the experience of the Trump presidency, I do not expect to see any diminution in the devotion that progressives show towards the American presidency. I think they'll see Trump as kind of a one-off, and they'll go back to celebrating political figures like President Kennedy. And thank you for pointing me in that direction. I mean, I forgot to mention when you asked the first question about Kennedy, just the remarkably over-the-top rhetoric, this notion, again, that the president can be as big as he wants. Kennedy once said that no problem of human nature was beyond man's reason.
Yeah,
we can achieve the impossible. We will bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe, and arguably that leads us into the jungles of Vietnam, and more. Just remarkably over the top pledges about what the presidency will be the center of action. In a way, the fate of all mankind rests on the American presidency. Just remarkably over the top rhetoric that I believe, again, has contributed to this, as you put it, or as I put it in the book as well, this never-ending cycle of raised hope, and then followed by despair.
I remember seeing these portraits of Obama in the 2008 presidential campaign on people's cars. Hope, underneath his name.
Yeah.
And I forget the person who had designed all these. They were wildly successful, and of course you're thinking, for what? Tell me more. But the level of the willingness to believe in it, and it goes on. You have another blistering chapter, I think, on Donald Trump. Before we talk about that, though, thinking about the constitutional presidency and the populist presidency, I guess I told you before we got online, sort of my head in my hands, thinking about any hopes for revival. And I suppose it would be in a way, it would require great personality and someone willing to, and under the right circumstances, and also a willingness to employ rhetoric. Maybe even, Christenhuth has said a willingness to work with the Congress, even in diminution of some executive powers currently held, to try and restore that. But that seems like a heavy lift.
It does. It does. I try to offer a few suggestions as to how we might get back, how we might rediscover this lost constitutional presidency. I do believe restoring the power of the party leadership, of the so-called superdelegates at the National Convention, to serve at least as some filtering force for the selection of presidential nominees. I mean, look, in 2016, Bernie Sanders almost won the nomination of a party to which he did not belong. And I would also argue that Donald Trump, certainly his past record, didn't indicate to me any widely, deeply shared views on conservatism or Republican Party principles. So in 2016, you almost had a contest between two folks that didn't belong to the political parties which they were nominated by. And I just think that's just not healthy. There has to be some filtering elements here, and I think superdelegates arguably could play that role. And I also try to make the case that ultimately this is on us. This is on the American people. We seem to fall for these inflated pledges, this inflated rhetoric that tells us that, my nomination marks the point at which the oceans begin to cool. I'm going to build a... Is that what it was?
Doing the oceans heal, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Or, we're going to build a wall and the Mexicans are going to pay for it. I mean, both parties play this promise game that, again, ends up in dashed expectations. And it requires the American public, I think, to adopt a more adopt more sober expectations about what the federal government and the presidency can deliver. I wish I could say I was optimistic, but I'm not particularly optimistic.
You note this in the book. The return of the constitutional presidency would require the public to surrender what it thinks is power, namely its power to determine the nominee of a party. But would actually, if they could see the longer, they would actually gain, in the form of better government, more limited government. But it would require, say, and you note this in the book, many have noted this, these nomination contests where you go from state to state, and it's, great media fun to go, New Hampshire, we go to Iowa, and then we go to New Hampshire, then we go to South Carolina and all of this stuff. But it leads to sort of an extreme. Who can be the loudest? And that's, see these debates. These aren't debates. It's, so who can actually be provocative and make a call for, the government delivering health care to every American or something like that. And you move away from something behind the door, behind closed doors and a brokered convention or selection of a nominee on that basis, which we would sort of think is wrong and would be perceived as wrong in the Republican and Democratic Party. We want to choose the nominee, but even a feature like that, but that would actually strengthen the parties. I mean, this is Trump and Sanders are able to take over these parties because the parties themselves actually are quite weak institutionally. Correct. Because of these reforms.
That's right, Richard. I couldn't agree more. Again, the odds of this happening, we've become so convinced that, look, there's some good reason here. We've become convinced that decisions that are made behind closed doors are just by their nature corrupt. I try to make the case in the book that a lot of those 19th century presidents that are frequently derided as do-nothing presidents and who will never make it onto Mount Rushmore, but nonetheless, most of them did not do harm. Most of them were selected either by congressional leaders or a combination of congressional leaders and some party activists. I don't even shouldn't use that word. Party officials around the nation. And they tended to pick cautious, moderate, arguably pragmatic, in some cases controllable men. But I'm not sure that's all bad. We somehow decided that is bad. But I think I would hold some of these so-called 19th century mediocrities up against some of their 20th century successors. I would hold them up to them and say, actually, I'd take Benjamin Harrison over some of those folks.
You also, you talk. I liked your chapter on Gerald Ford as well.
Oh, thanks.
We've the work of Alex Heinemann on Ford, and you note that Ford, in a way, maybe an honorable mention here of trying to embody at least certain elements of the founder's presidency. I thought at times in the book too, your last chapter on Donald Trump, the apotheosis of the populist presidency. And it seems like in the book too, you're sort of dropping breadcrumbs of how, this sort of leads to this presidency, this populist presidency, the rhetoric, the way opponents are treated, the way government is utilized, the way media is used, and that Trump, in a way, in an unstable way, has put all of this together. Combined with now we have the technology of social media, and has sort of mastered this, and so here we are with this presidency. But of course, no, as we've mentioned, this doesn't seem to be dawning on people that there's wisdom to be learned here from this presidency. There's, or rather, from the way it's being conducted, we're likely to get sort of a punitive, progressive presidency as a result.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I just flat out say that Donald Trump is, we're 100 years removed from Woodrow Wilson's presidency, from Woodrow Wilson's impact on the office of the presidency and how we select presidential candidates. And in so many ways, Donald Trump is the fulfillment of the Wilsonian vision. He does have a strong bond with his base. And it's a bond based almost entirely on personal qualities. They like the fact that he's a fighter. They like the fact that he says what they like to hear, particularly about people they dislike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's in some ways Wilson's dream come true. Now Wilson would probably consider him something of a nightmare. Certainly, some of Wilson's successors see him that way. But I think Wilson helped to kick the doors in and led to the presidency of Donald Trump. I want to make it clear, you sort of did this for me earlier. This is not, it's a tough chapter on Trump, no doubt. But I actually started writing this book, or at least thinking about this book, during the Obama presidency. So this is not,
which many would argue makes possible the Trump presidency and the way in which Obama handled his opponents. Yeah,
correct. This is not a Trump bashing. It's a tough chapter on Donald Trump, but I did not write this book simply for that reason. We've been on this road for some time, quite some time.
What do you think are? And we talked about prospects for renewal. I guess we were pessimistic. We could be even more pessimistic. What do you think are likely results or going forward with regard to American constitutional order?
Again, I hate to to end on a down note, but generally speaking, when presidents have either flaunted their power or kicked, destroyed or eroded certain norms, it may take some time, but usually down the road somebody follows who perhaps does even more damage and flaunts even more norms. So maybe it's my New England upbringing. Maybe I have a touch of Puritanism in me, but I wish I could be more optimistic. But I would not be at all surprised, whether it's in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, that we're followed at some point down the road by Trump squared.
Is the only thing, and you do this in the book, and you point to civics education. That seems unlikely. Just making the American people aware of the founder's presidency or the American founding, to the extent Americans are becoming aware of the American founding. It may be, now there's this attempt to say it's a racist or a slave-based constitutional founding on the part of many progressive scholars, and even, say the New York Times recent project. So civics education seems difficult, but is one way that republics have dealt with decay or try to ward off decay. Another thing would just be the awareness that the federal government really can't do that much, and this increasing dysfunctionality becoming a norm, and maybe that leads people to think twice, although the evidence is not really there for that. So, yeah, I suppose I'm somewhat pessimistic as well, but there's also a human nature that does ultimately demand some sort of order, some sort of good order, and that would be something you could build on, I think.
Yeah.
Look,
I try, I do my best. I teach, I've been teaching programs out at the Ashbrook Center, the Masters in American History and Government there, which teaches high school students and emphasizes original source material. Terrific programs, terrific teachers. There are lots of things that can be done. I certainly try to do that, but it certainly is an uphill battle. And look, one of the reasons why I spent some time dealing with the whole issue of race, and even talking about it in terms of Washington and Hamilton and Jefferson, is I do think we put a little too much emphasis on the sort of the Virginian sources of the founding. And there's this whole other, certainly not necessarily abolitionist tradition, but anti-slavery tradition that one can find in the Federalists. You see it in Adams. You see it to some extent in Hamilton. You certainly see it in John Jay. And perhaps one avenue in which, in terms we can get at this question of the founders and race, and put perhaps a different angle on it, or put a light on this tradition that was anti-slavery right from the start. John Jay, for instance, is an incredibly interesting character on this question. But he just doesn't get the same amount of attention as the Virginians do. And again, maybe here I'm showing my Massachusetts bias.
No, I think I think that's well noted. As well, someone pointed out to me in the Constitutional Convention, the 3/5 clause was actually introduced by popular sovereignty. I think it was Rufus King, and I'm blanking on the other person, who would have been also anti-slavery.
Right.
And so if that's true, then the 3/5 clause is not as it's popularly presented to us. That changes our thinking there. Right. No, I think that's all well taken. Stephen Knott, thank you so much. We've been talking with Stephen Knott, political science professor at the Naval War College, about his new book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It was terrific.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.